boys and girls, this period of time that we have come together, I guess this past few weeks, and talked about how to tell stories and how to be clear in what you say and how to get people to listen to what you say. And today has just about finished me off, I have to say, because I've been listening to the grand debate that they've had on television. And you, of course, know that the politics of this earth are so unsure right now, along with everything else, with the pandemic things that are going bad, and we have to worry about how we're going to do this, and I have to be so careful about being so old and taking germs into a school or something and not being able to go. We just don't really know exactly how to communicate with each other in an effective way so that we won't either bore somebody to death or we get them all excited and worried about things. Life is not easy if you can't express yourself and make yourself clear about how you feel about politics or religion, or when somebody's a bully, you're afraid to tell on them, or there's all sorts of things that come up that makes it hard for people to communicate in an effective way. Some of these old stories that I've been telling you had to do with me growing up out in the country and listening to my great-grandfather tell stories and explain things about times before they were today. Well, for instance, now, if you remember back when I first introduced myself to you and began telling, way back when I remember the story about old Wicked John and the devil and those stories, Pap had a way of telling things in what I would refer to as a jovial way. In other words, he didn't mind telling things and talking about how things used to be. And of course, I loved listening to that. And I picked up little ideas that made me be able to communicate and tell stories and read to people and to talk to people about different things. And sometimes I was able to people to understand what I was trying to say and feel the same things that I felt about certain things. This is an important skill. And you use every part of your body to be able to do it well. For instance, you don't just look at somebody when you're trying to tell them something. You use your body language to express something. You use your hands to emphasize things and say, this is important. Now listen. We do little techniques and little clues that cause us to do a better job of communication. Well, today's our last story on this series. I'd like to say we might do another series sometime for that, because I have a bunch of stories that I haven't even begun to talk about, that I still remember how Pap told them and how well he told them and how much all of us kids enjoyed those things. But think about these things. When you're listening, not only do you use your eyes to pick up ideas, but you listen with your ears, picking up sound, and sound is a very important thing to be able. You actually might think about the odor of something, and to emphasize a strong point, like in a ghost story or a mystery story, you might emphasize the emphasis you might have on smell and taste. And remember that story I told you about the wicked witch with 3 eyes, and that you couldn't lie to the eye in the middle of her forehead, and she was able to control the whole world she lived in because she was able to discern the difference between lying and the truth. And those are very important skills to be able to do, boys and girls, because you are always going to be challenged to interpret where somebody is telling truth all the time, or somebody might be lying. We don't like to think that's true, but you know, and I know, there are some people that are very good at expressing themselves. So I kind of wanted to pull my stories together with a story. You know, most of my stories that I've told have Jack, and I use the technique of using the same name over and over again because it helps me remember the story and not get my characters mixed up so well. So the story I'm going to tell today is a story that's different from Jack. Most of my stories we've talked about are young people and teenagers or children. But today, I'm going to tell you about Jack when he got to be an older man. Now, these stories that I have told, most of them, the time setting is important. Most of these are stories that happened before or during what we refer here in the southern Appalachian region, we refer to as, this is the Civil War period, or the war between the states, depending on which side you were on. We don't like to think about a great dissension, but this year has made us to take into consideration that things do happen even today in modern times. This pandemic epidemic that we have been through is something that makes us stop and re-examine our lives and re-examine how we're living and see what we can do to compensate from some of the terrible things that can happen in an epidemic that causes hundreds, even thousands of people to die. So this story is from a different setting when Jack got to be a much older man. In fact, according to Pap, when he was telling these stories, Jack joined the army during the war and was a very good soldier. Now, he was a very good soldier for many reasons. For first, Jack didn't read too well, but he did listen, and he did pay attention, and he always followed instructions. You remember Mama, back in early stories, she preached, said, Jack, always do what Mama tells you, because following somebody else's advice is a good, important thing for us to do in our interpretation of doing what is good for communication and telling stories. Jack stayed in the army until he was an old man and ready to retire because he listened, he followed directions, and he always did exactly as he was told to do, which makes a good soldier when you come right down to think about it. Well, time went on, and as he got to be an older man, Jack's commanding officer came to him one day and he said, Jack, sir, said Jack. He says, what can I do for you? Because like I told you, Jack was a very good soldier and he knew how to listen. He said, Jack, did you know it's time for you to get out of the army and go back home and go live in a normal life? He says, you can't just keep on marching up and down. There's not a war to fight and we don't have to. Jack thought, what in the world will I do? How in the world will I make a living? Because in those days, there was no retirement pay for soldiers. In fact, everybody worked, even till there was no social security checks for the old folks. Times was hard, and Jack thought, what in the world will I do, and how in the world will I make a living? Because I don't know how to do anything except be in the army. So Jack, finally he said, sir, will y'all be able to give me? He said, well, here you are, Jack, about 300 miles from your home up in the mountains. He says, I tell you what. He said, I'll bake you up 3 big loaves of fresh bread. He said, you can take that bread in with you, and said, you can slice your bread up, and said, that'll see you home, and then you can kind of get your farm to going back. And he said, sir, that farm's been gone for years. My ma and pa and my grandparents have been dead and gone. He said, how can an old feller get out of the army and make a living and take care of himself? I can't work like I used to. And he said, I just don't know what I'll do. So Jack left the army with 3 loaves of bread. And that, boy, it smelled good, but Jack knew well and good he ought not to eat that bread all at one time, no matter how good it smelled. And he started walking 300 miles back up in the Appalachian Mountains toward his farm. Well, as he was walking along, he thought, what in the world will I be able to do? So Jack stopped beside the road, and he by a little spring, and he kind of built up a little place like that to build up a fire and everything, and sliced him off a piece of that bread. And he thought, well, I'll sit right down here and have me a good supper with bread and fresh water. He took an old sycamore leaf and made a cup out of it and reached over to get a drink out of that little spring. And he was sitting there, and he heard somebody coming up the road. And he looked down the road, and there was an old woman. Why, she probably was 90 years old if she was a day. And Jack saw her walking, and she was all stooped over and had her a cane to kind of prod along. The poor old lady was having a hard time of it, I'm telling you. And she was thinking, oh me, oh my, I'm as hungry as I've ever been in my life. And Jack heard the poor lady talk about it. He thought, well, I can at least share some of my bread with that old woman. So he took his hat off and bowed down, and he said, good grandmother, come have a seat. I'll be glad to give you some of this nice fresh bread for supper. She says, well, young man, I'd be plumb proud to have it. She said, I've been looking for somebody like you that's generous and kind and helpful. She says, I thank you most kindly. So he made her a leaf out of that sycamore leaf, and he cut her a slice of bread, and they ate. And she says, you know what my life has been all these years? I've been a herb woman. She says, I was raised up in the mountains area, and when I grew up, the Indians and my mamas and my grandparents taught me what plants was good for what ails folks, and I would gather them, and if we'd have an epidemic or sickness or something, I would go and cure them of whatever ails them, or else I'd kind of point them in the way of glory land, you know, if what I mean. And Jack laughed because he did know exactly what it meant for somebody to be hunting away to glory land. So they sat and talked, and finally, after a spell, she started to get up. She said, you know what, young man? I've been alive for a long, long time. And she says, I've just about wore this old earth out, and it's time for me to go. And I've been looking to tell some people about some of the things that I know about. She says, and I'm going to share them with you because you've been kind and good and shared that with me. And she reached over in a bag that she had over. She took this big old leather bag out. Strangest looking thing you ever saw, boys and girls. All made up of soft leather and had strange looking stuff wrote on it and carved on it. And she handed said, Jack, I'm aiming to give this to you because I ain't got nobody to leave it to. All my folks is dead and gone. He, of course, had been trained by his grandmother to be nice and polite and thankful for anybody that he says, well, thank you, grandmother. not thinking anything about it much, you know. And she said, oh, you think it ain't much. But she said, look at it. Do you see all this stuff that's writ on the side of it and carved on it and everything, and how it's got a good, strong top to it so it won't come open? She said, this is a magic vine. It has all sorts of power. She said, well, look. And about that time, a duck started flying from a tree across there, and she says, look at that duck yonder. And she grabbed that sack up, reached in and got a stick and hit that stack, and she said, whickety whack, let that dove come get in my sack. Jack kind of smiled. He thought, this poor old lady, she's kind of getting old and kind of getting, you know, some. But he looked, and lo and behold, boys and girls, that duck kind of swooped around like this and flew right down and flew in that sack, and Jack tied it up. And she said, now, take this here Jack with you, Jack, and when you want to catch something and keep it up, she says, you can catch it and not have to chase it down or kill it with a gun or anything. Well, thank you, grandmother. Oh, she said, that ain't all at all. She says, the next thing I'm going to give you is my coat. Jack looked at it, and now it was, I have to admit, pretty worn. It had places it had patches on it and stitches on it, but it too kind of had some strange words carved down the back of the middle of it. And she said, now Jack, she said, put this coat around you when it gets cold. But that ain't the main part of it. Said it's magical too. And as long as you got that coat around you, there won't nobody ever be able to see you. No matter what you're doing, you will become invisible. Jack says, ma'am, and Jack thought, that ain't possible. That ain't realistic. She's kind of, like I say, but the old woman grabbed that coat and flung it around her shoulders. And by goodness, you couldn't see her, not anywhere at all. She'd take it off, and he could see her standing there just as well. And she said, this will keep you from having to hide and hunt something all the time. This will be a coat of safety to take care of you. But that ain't all. And she reached in the pocket of the coat and brought out a little jar, a little bottle, just about that size. And it was clear as crystal. And she smiled. But this is the greatest thing that made me such a powerful, powerful medicine woman. She said, Jack, this little jar, when you put fresh spring water in it and shake it up and look at somebody that's been sick or had a long time of having something wrong with them, everything, if death is standing at the foot of the bed, you know you can do almost anything with medicine and get that person to going again. But if death is standing at the head of the bed with his old bony hands reaching out to take that person to glory land, you back up. Don't ever argue when death claims a soul like that, because you don't have power over death. And Jack thought, what a strange, strange gift. But like I say, he'd been trying to be polite, and he said, oh, grandmother, I thank you most kindly. I'm beholden to you. Thank you kindly. And the old lady, she says, well, like I say, it's time for me to decide it's time for me to leave, and I don't need these things anymore, and I'm giving them to you. You find your place, set you up a little business and become an herb doctor. It says, you'll have a wonderful, wonderful way to make a living the rest of your life. Jack kind of smiled because, like I told you, he kind of thought the old woman was crazy. But nevertheless, the old woman went on walking down the road, a singing and a praising the good Lord above. And Jack sat there and kind of smiled, and he said, well, I hope her well. I do indeed. And he took up his gifts and put them in his bag and started walking. Well, of course, Jack walked quite a distance till he come to this big little town. Well, it was not a real big town, but it was big enough to have a, and he walked up to the inn door. Now, inn is a fancy word we used to give for hotels and motels and things like that. And he went up and went knock, knock, knock on the door. And a man came to the door, and he said, the town's full, there ain't no room to be had nowheres at all. And Jack says, well, sir, I'm obliged to you for the information, but what I'm really looking for is a job where I could earn a little money for supper. There ain't no food left. There's been a big amount of people coming through, and there just ain't nothing left here anymore. And Jack says, sir, and he pointed to a turkey that was sitting on a limb up in the tree that had just gone to roost. Now, if you're a country boy or girl, you know when they get a certain time in the evening and the sun goes down, they go and get what they call on the roost. They fly up in a tree, and they'll stay there all the night, so they'll be safe. And he took that old sack out and hit it and said, whickety-whack, whickety-whack, let that turkey come get in this sack. And that turkey left that tree after he had already gone up there to roost and flew down and got in the sack. And Jack turned around and handed it to the innkeeper, and he said, sir, if you will bake this here chicken for tomorrow, I'd be obliged if you'd let me stay the night. And the man thought, well, that's a good trade. And he indeed killed the turkey and put it into bake. Now, you know it takes a long time to cook a turkey, but Jack went up in the top of the inn and took a night's sleep while the turkey was cooking. The next morning, he said, sir, could you point me in a direction where I might be able to find me a little house to rent or a barn or a farm to let? And the man says, up the road twixt here and Halifax, you'll find an old barn and farm that man's been trying to sell for years and years, but I don't think he's going to be able to sell it because he's asking too much money. And besides that, everybody knows that place is haunted. Jack said, haunted? What do you mean? They don't know what they mean. They just know that when somebody goes up there to clean it up and work or things like that, they never heard from or seen again. So folks just naturally know that there's ghosts and haunts that are there, and we don't try to go up there. Jack thought, well, I know there ain't no such thing as ghosts and haunts and such like that. I'll go up there and see what I can do. So the next morning he packed his work, ate a good breakfast. That turkey was the very best of eating. So he took his plunder and put it back in his bag again and went walking up the road. Well, he kept walking and walking, and he walked several miles and began to think the man didn't know what he was talking about. But all of a sudden he saw this little boy coming up the road, and he had a fishing line and a pole on his back, and he was just whistling and singing because he did love to go a-fishing. Young man, can you tell me where there might be a farm up here that's for sale? Oh, you're talking about the Halifax place. Yes, I am, said Jack. He said, sir, you don't want to go there. Them Halifax people, she said, that place is haunted. Folks go up there to get a job and work, and they're never seen or heard from again. Now, Jack wasn't a man that was feared of much. He'd lived his life fighting in an army, and he'd lived his life scrounging around just to stay alive. And he wasn't afraid of any ghost. But nevertheless, he says, where do I talk about the man that owns the farm? So the young man told him where the farm man lived, and he went over. And the man come out and he says, son, I just don't want to sell that to nobody. I've done sent 5 young men up to claim that their farm, and that was a good farm at one time, but those folks were never heard from again. Jack says, well, make it 1 more, 6, and I guarantee you, tomorrow when you come up there, I'll be working that land and clearing that up, because I intend to do something with it and open me up a doctor's office there, because he had an idea of how he might be able to make a living, just doctoring folks and making them well with things that the old woman had taught him, as well as the things he remembered from all the herbs and things. The man tried to talk him out, but nevertheless, Jack went up, and he could see, you never saw the like of kudzu and honeysuckle vine and briars, and he began to work, and he worked all day cutting back. Well, he finally cut back in this area, and he could see there was a little house and a barn under there. He got them all cleared up and come on, and he could see the sun was going down. He thought, well, I better go inside. And he walked inside the house, and it was a nice little house inside, but you could tell there hadn't been anybody lived there in a long time. There was an old beat-up rocking chair over by a fireplace. So he built a fire in the fireplace, and he was a humming and a singing, because he was fixing to eat some of that turkey that he had brought with him, plus the rest of his bread. And he built a fire in the fireplace. In a minute, there kept things falling out of the fireplace, and a bird or two flew out, and he could hear there was noise. And he thought, what in the flim-flam is coming out of that fireplace? And he got down, and he looked up under the fireplace like that, and sure enough, kerchunk, right smack dab in his face, dropped this devil. He knowed it was the devil because he was as red as fire, and he had horns and a long pointed tail, and he leaned back down there, and he said, come on out, brothers, we got somebody to play poker with. Jack thought, what in the world is this devil a-talking about? Now, Jack knew a lot about playing poker. He'd been in the Army for now on to more than 20 years, and one of the favorite things the Army boys did was play poker. And so, sure enough, kerchunk, kerchunk, 3 devils. And he said, are there any more of you? They said, nope, not a narrow one, and there won't be one in a little while too. And they began a long night of playing poker. Now, Jack was pretty good, but he weren't near as good as those 3 devils was. Why, he would win from one, and then he'd lose from one, and then he'd win. It went on all night long, and he could see that those devils were getting real antsy because Jack was sort of taking money from them, and they didn't like that. And Jack could see, my Lord. And sure enough, first thing he noticed, they grabbed their swords out of their scabbards, and they were making up to fight with Jack. Now, how in the world, Jack thought, is a common, ordinary man going to fight with 3 devils? And he thought, what'll I do? What'll I do? Where if I don't do something, they're going to kill me for sure. Well, so you're not going to believe this. But the first thing he decided, he thought, he grabbed that sack out again and that stick, and he went, wiggity-whack, wiggity-whack. Let them devils come get in the sack. And boys and girls, do you believe this? Them devils stopped right in their tracks, put their swords back in their scabbards, and all three of them lined up and marched and got in that sack, and that sack made the tight closed up tight. And lo and behold, Jack thought, what in the world am I going to do with 3 devils in a sack? What do I do with them? What do I do with them? And he thought, he could not even begin to think. So he put it over by the fireplace, and he got himself a coverlet from over in the corner and wrapped up and went to sleep. Well, the next morning, the farmer come a-looking to see if he could bury his body, because he just knowed that he would be dead like them other folks he'd sent up there. And he come up there and saw Jack just working up a storm. And he said, Jack, you ain't dead? Jack said, nope. He said, but I did have a night where I didn't get a lot of rest. And he told him about how he caught the devils in the sack. And he said, sir, what do you recommend I do with a sack full of the devil? Because I can't open them up. They're men that you can't fight with normal ways. And the farmer says, well, I don't know for sure, but if it was me, I'd take them down to the blacksmith shop, and when they started making hooves and beating that metal and all and that fire and everything, I'd just tell them to beat that sack with them devils in it. So that's exactly what Jack did. He went walking down to the road to the blacksmith shop. And when that blacksmith fired up that furnace and he was beating on a piece of metal to make horseshoes and making things to work in then he told Jack what he was doing, and Jack says, I'll give you a good coat that'll keep you warm all winter if you'll just pound this sack with that. And that blacksmith began to pound. You have never seen such an explosion. Why, it was like all the fireworks went off against the black sky. Fire ran out red and green and blue, and until there was nothing left in the sack except a lot of dust and ashes. Actually, there was no devil in there at all. And Jack reached in and sifted that dirt, and he said, boy, that'll make good fertilizer. And he took that fertilizer sack back up to his farm, and he scattered it all around the barn and the gardens and all. And he began to raise herbs that he knew about from the mountains, until pretty soon, in a month or so, Jack got this great big letter from the king of the land saying, I've heard tell you're a powerful good and a powerful strong magician and healer. Because back in those days, if you were a healer, they thought you kind of was magical anyway, and that the magicians, and that was another way they would to identify good folks and bad folks. So Jack took the title of Dr. Jack, known throughout the world as a great man that could solve all sorts of mysteries and heal things that weren't usually healed. And Jack lived for years and years, and every once in a while, he and the king would talk back and forth, because the man got to really, really respecting Jack. Well, time went on and on and on, and one day he got a letter from the king. He said, Dear Jack, my daughter is very sick unto death. He says, everybody says that she can't be cured and that there's nothing left but just to pack her things and get her ready to go to Glory Land. Well, he says, would you come and see? But mind you now, I'm a jealous king, and if you say you think you might cure her and you don't, I'll chop off your head. So Jack just ignored him. He said, I ain't going down there. If I do not cure her, he said, I'll lose my head. If I were to cure, what good would it do me? So he just ignored what the king said. Well, did you know that kings, when they run a country, they don't necessarily go by everything like anybody else. They don't have to follow the rules, is what I'm saying. And so the king, anytime anybody came up and said they were going to be able to cure his daughter and they didn't, off comes the head. Well, he sent the army up there to take Jack back. Now, I know Jack had sense enough not to argue with a bunch of soldiers because he knew how they were. But they come marching up to his gate one day and opened up the gate and come marching and said, the king said to come, and if you cure his daughter, he'll give you a wagon load of gold. Now, you and I done talked about a wagon load of gold, and we know that that does happen in stories sometime, but it's kind of an imaginary thing. There might or there might not even be as much gold in the world as a wagon load. Jack says, well, and he packed up his plunder in his sack, got all of his plunder together, and down the road they went to the castle. And he thought, now what am I going to do to be absolutely assured that I'll be able to cure the girl and not get my head chopped off? So they walked up to the castle door, and the king was walking the floor and fretting and fussing and complaining. He said, I done sent for you 2 or 3 times and you ignored me. If you don't cure my daughter and do it quick, off comes your head. Well, it kind of put Jack in a bad position, and he thought, what am I going to do? When he remembered that little glass bottle, and he put it in his hand down in his pocket and took that little bottle out, and he went over to the spring right smack dab in the middle of town and put that bottle down and filled it up with water. Then he shook it up real good. He thought, I'm going to see what my odds are if I can cure that girl or not. And he went walking in, and there she lay, la, sick, running a high fever, all just worn completely out. Jack took that bottle up and looked through it, and there stood Death, right smack dabbed up by her pillar, not down at the foot of the bed. If he'd been down there, Jack could have thought, I can get her full of medicine. But she wouldn't know, there was no use of trying. And he thought, what in the world am I going to do? Because Death was just about to reach out and grab that young'un and take her right on to the promised land. Well, indeed, when he saw Death reaching that bony skeletal hand down for that girl, Jack grabbed that sack up and hit it, whackety-whack, whackety-whack. Let old Death come get in this sack. Just like you're predicting. Death stopped and stood up straight and still and turned himself around and looked at Jack with the biggest surprise you ever seen on Death's face. Marched right over and clumb down in that sack, and Jack tied it up. And then he sat down. Why, he hadn't been sitting down there 10 minutes till that girl sat up and she said, Daddy, I'm so hungry I could eat a cow. And the man king come around, you've cured her, you've cured her, you've cured my daughter. And he turned around, he says, stick around here, Jack. Says, you can get married up to my daughter and run this place when I'm dead and gone. Jack says, whoa, wait a minute. I don't need a wife. I'm old and I'm too old to be a wife for. She's got a long life to live. You let her pick. Well, that was very much against the king's rules at that time, because at that time, if the king had a daughter and she was going, he would see who she married and what kind of allegiance he could get with another place. And so he says, well, let me give you your wagon load of gold. And sure enough, up come riding a whole army with a wagon loaded up with the most beautiful golden pieces. Oh, Jack reached over and let the gold trickle through his fingers and fall down, and he laughed. He says, you know what? I don't reckon I'm going to ever have to hit another thing or cure another body. He says, because this gold will last me the rest of my life. And he turned around and started marching home. And the king's army went with him till he got back. They got back to the farm, and the old man sat down in the front yard. And he looked down at that sack. He thought, now, and you think about this. He says, what can a feller do with a sack full of death? If I open that up, what's going to happen? I'd be the first one in line. And he thought, I can't open that up. I can't ever let death out of that sack. But what will I do with it? And he's sitting on the front porch, and he looked out. Now, in his front yard, there was a big old tree, big old beech tree. And young'uns, I'll bet you that tree was 100 foot high or more. And he thought, you know, if that sack was up in the tip top of that tree with a good hammer and nail, wouldn't nobody ever even see it, know it was there. And I wouldn't ever have to tell nobody about it. But there was a little young man working down in the garden. And Jack says, son, come up here. Can you climb that tree? Oh, yes, sir, I can climb that tree, he said. He says, well, climb that tree and take this here sack and these hammers and nails and nail that sack against the trunk of that tree so the wind won't ever blow it down. And he said, and never tell nobody about it. And so, indeed, the young boy nailed that sack to the top of the tree, and he climbed down. And Jack said, now you go on, go about your work, and we ain't never going to tell nobody what happened to death. And so, indeed, well, that does create a problem. There's never, ever just a simple thing happen with a solution. And Jack thought, well, what in the world is going to happen to the world if there ain't no death? You know, I bet not many people back in those days had ever thought about what would the world be like if nobody ever died. And things just kept on going like they was. Well, sure enough, things began to change soon. There weren't much left but old folks, and they couldn't hardly get around. They couldn't hardly take care of themselves because they was old and decrepit and in pain a lot. And they moaned and they groaned. And you know what? Jack never thought a thing about that. And he lived on and on. And one morning he got up and he looked down and he had a beard, boys and girls. It reached off from his chin choker right down to the floor and puddled up on the floor. He'd have to move his beard out of the way when he did this and that. And he thought, and then he noticed the water was getting kind of muddy looking and it wasn't clear and sparkly bright like it used to be. And there weren't near enough food to go around because there was so many people. They eat it up by the time it got ready to be picked and grown. In fact, when you come down to it, he thought, death is a pretty important thing in this cycle of living, because you can't just have world without death in it, because if it keeps on going and you've got to, things have got to keep growing with it. And he thought, what am I going to do? Well, one day he was sitting there, and this old woman come walking up the road. Dr. Jack, Dr. Jack. Yes, ma'am, what can I do for you? She said, oh, Dr. Jack, do you not know me at all? No, I don't remember. I don't think I've ever met you, ma'am. She says, well, I'm the king's daughter that you cured years and years and years ago. And she said, Jack, I've lived my lifespan out, and I'm old, and I'm decrepit, and my bones ache, and I'm in pain, and I knowed you was the one that could help me. And Jack thought, you know what? I am responsible for death, being a prisoner and never being able to take anybody away from earth. And now the earth's all out of kilter, and folks is old and sick and in pain, and the water is bad, and the food is not enough. And he thought, and I'm responsible. And you know, sometimes we all have to accept the fact that we are responsible for whatever we decide to do in this old world. Much as I hate to admit it, I have to admit there's times when I should have done things and I should have been concerned about them. Old Jack sat there in his rocker, rocking back and forth, thinking about what in the world could he do, because it was his responsibility. Well, he was sitting there thinking about it, and he noticed the young boy had made him an old man. He said, can you still climb that tree? Yes, sir, I can. He said, well, climb up there and be careful now. Don't break that sack open. Bring it back to me. So the man went up the tree, and he undid the sack and brought it back, and he sat it down right smack dabbed between Jack's legs. And Jack thought, it is my responsibility. And he got to thinking about his life, how much fun he had had living and fighting in the wars and being a doctor and being able to cure folks, and how he liked all those good things of sense of power. And Jack thought, but it's nevertheless, I have to admit, earth is my responsibility. So he said, so well and good, I've got to take my chances. And he reached down and he untied the top of that old sack. And out sprang Death, just as happy. Oh, Jack, I knowed you. And I knowed you had a conscience. And I knowed you'd face up to your responsibility. And I knowed you'd realize that death is not always our enemy. Sometimes he might be our friend. And Jack kind of smiled and he said, and so Death reached over and got the sack and said, whickety-whack, whickety-whack, let old Jack get in this here sack. And Jack climbed in the sack, and Death tied the top together. And Death went about his business. And Jack, if you ever take a notion, you might write a Jack tale or tell a little story or remember, you are the only one that can tell your story the way that you want it to be told. And after all, isn't it your responsibility? Don't you have to kind of face up to these things every once in a while? I know I do. And I have to say to myself, now, Billie Jean, you know what? You are responsible for your own actions, and you've got to take the consequences no matter whatever they are. You do that, and you become a writer and write a big book or a movie or television, and you say, oh, I can think about when Miss Seals was telling us these old stories a long, long ago. And she told the story of old soldier Jack, how he conquered the devil and actually the evils of death and lived. Well, let's use something happy. Happy ever after, because it does make me happy to be able to communicate with you. Thank you. Thank you for listening.